The wind in Coal Hollow didn't moan, it screamed. It tore through the gaps in the shanty walls, carrying the taste of coal dust and freezing rain that had turned the muddy streets into a black churning river. Inside the O'Malley shack, the air was thick with the smell of cheap gin and unwashed bodies. Clara O'Malley huddled in the corner by the cold stove, her knees pulled to her chest, trying to make herself small. She was 20 years old, but in the dim light of the tallow candle she looked like a broken doll. Her calico dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing skin that was already mottling with fresh bruises, purple blooming like dark flowers on pale snow. She squeezed her eyes shut, listening to the heavy, uneven footsteps of her father, Seamus O'Malley. Thud, scrape, thud. "You think you're clever, girl?" Seamus slurred, his voice a wet rasp. He paced the small room, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the peeling wallpaper. He held a heavy leather belt in his hand, the buckle clinking softly as it dragged on the floor. "I didn't say anything, Pa," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "I just said the flour is gone. We have nothing to eat." "Don't lie to me," Seamus roared, spinning around. The sudden movement made him stumble, but he caught himself on the table, sending a tin cup clattering to the floor. "You're hiding it. You're hoarding it for yourself while your own father starves, while I work my fingers to the bone in that mine." He hadn't worked in the mine for 6 months. The gin had taken his job, then his dignity, and finally, his humanity. He lunged. Clara didn't scream. She had learned long ago that screaming only made him swing harder. She curled into a ball, protecting her head with her arms. Crack! The belt struck her shoulder. It was a sharp, stinging fire that cut through the dull ache of her old bruises. She bit her lip until she tasted copper. "Ungrateful wretch! Crack! Useless mouth! Crack!" The blows fell like rain, rhythmic, relentless. Clara dissociated. She stared at a crack in the floorboards, counting the splinters. 1, 2, 3. If she counted enough splinters, maybe she would disappear. Maybe she would float out of her body and leave this pain behind. "Please, Pa," she gasped between strikes. "Please stop." "I'll stop when you learn respect," Seamus shouted, his face purple with rage and exertion. He raised the belt high, the buckle catching the candlelight. He brought it down with everything he had. It hit her temple. A white-hot flash of agony exploded behind her eyes. The world tilted. Clara slumped sideways, her vision swimming with black spots. She tasted bile. "This is it," she thought with a strange, detached calm. "He's finally going to do it. He's going to kill me tonight." Seamus stood over her, breathing heavy, his chest heaving. He wiped sweat from his brow with a shaking hand. He looked down at his daughter, bleeding, broken, silent. "Get up," he hissed. "Don't you play dead with me." Clara tried. She really did. She pushed against the floor with her trembling hands, but her arms gave out. She collapsed back into the dirt and dust. Seamus sneered. He raised the belt again. "I said get up." Outside, the storm raged. Thunder shook the thin walls of the shack. But then, a sound cut through the thunder. It was heavy. Rhythm. Thump, thump. It wasn't thunder. It was footsteps on the porch. Steps so heavy they rattled the jars on the shelf. Seamus froze. He lowered the belt, squinting at the door. "Who's there?" he shouted, trying to sound fierce but his voice cracking. "Get lost! This is a private home." The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a single massive impact. Boom! The door didn't just open. It exploded. The hinges shrieked as they were torn from the rotten wood. The latch shattered. The door flew inward, crashing onto the floorboards with a deafening bang, sending a cloud of dust and splinters into the room. The wind roared in, bringing a swirl of snow and sleet. And filling the doorway was a monster. He was huge, a wall of bare fur and muscle that blocked out the storm. He wore a coat made from the pelt of a grizzly, the massive head of the beast forming a hood over his own. He was soaked, water dripping from the fur onto the floor. His face was a landscape of scars, half hidden by a beard that was black as coal and stiff with ice. Arthur Vance, the grizzly. He stood there, breathing steam into the freezing room. His eyes pale blue and burning with a cold, terrifying fire scanned the scene. He saw the overturned cup. He saw the belt in Seamus's hand. Then he saw Clara. He saw the blood on her temple. He saw the fresh welts rising on her arms. He saw the way she lay crumpled on the floor, too weak to even lift her head. A sound rumbled in Arthur's chest. It wasn't a word. It was a growl, a low, vibrating sound that was more animal than human. Seamus backed away, dropping the belt. "Now hold on," he stammered, his face draining of color. This is family business, Vance. You got no right." Arthur didn't speak. He stepped into the room. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He moved with a terrifying, predatory speed. He crossed the distance to Seamus in 2 strides. Seamus tried to raise his hands. "Don't you touch me!" Arthur's fist, a sledgehammer of bone and callus, connected with Seamus's jaw. Crunch. The sound was sickeningly loud. Seamus's head snapped back. His feet left the floor. He flew backward, crashing into the wall and sliding down in a heap. He didn't move. He didn't groan. He was out cold. Arthur didn't look at him again. He turned to Clara. The rage in his face vanished, replaced by something that terrified her almost as much, a fierce, desperate focus. He knelt beside her. The floor shook as his knees hit the wood. "Clara," he rumbled. His voice was deep, rough like rocks tumbling in a canyon. Clara looked up at him through one swollen eye. "Arthur?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Am I dead?" "No," Arthur growled. "Not tonight." He reached out. His hands were massive, engulfed in leather gloves, but he touched her face with a surprising gentleness. He wiped a streak of blood from her cheek with his thumb. "Can you stand?" he asked. Clara shook her head weakly. I don't think so." Arthur nodded once. "Then I carry you." He didn't wait for permission. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. He lifted her effortlessly, as if she weighed nothing more than a bundle of dry kindling. He stood up, cradling her against his massive chest. The grizzly coat was rough against her skin, but it was warm, so incredibly warm. It smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and wild animal. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. Clara let her head fall against his shoulder. The movement sent a spike of pain through her neck, but the relief of being held, of being protected, was a balm that soothed the agony. Arthur turned to the door. He stepped over the wreckage of the shattered wood. He stepped over the unconscious form of her father without even a glance. He walked out onto the porch. The storm hit them instantly. The wind howled, trying to tear them apart. The sleet stung like needles. Arthur didn't falter. He pulled the edges of his massive coat around her, cocooning her inside the fur, shielding her from the biting cold. "Hold on," he commanded, his voice a vibration against her ear. He walked to where his horse, a giant Clydesdale that looked more like a plow beast than a mount, was tethered to the rail. The horse stomped in the mud, snorting steam. Arthur didn't put her down. He held her with one arm and grabbed the saddle horn with the other. With a grunt of effort, he swung himself up, pulling her into the saddle with him. He settled her in front of him, wrapping both arms around her to take the reins. He was a fortress of muscle and heat surrounding her on all sides. "We go up," he said into the wind. He kicked the horse. They surged forward, away from the shack, away from the town that had ignored her screams, and into the black freezing heart of the mountain. Clara closed her eyes and let the darkness take her, knowing that for the first time in her life, the monster carrying her was the one running away from the nightmare, not toward it. Gemini said. The ascent to the timberline was a journey through a white hell. The storm that had battered the valley floor was a living thing up here, a shrieking banshee of ice and wind that clawed at the riders with invisible talons. Clara drifted in and out of the darkness. Her head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic agony that matched the hoofbeats of the massive Clydesdale. She was encased in the grizzly coat, a cocoon of musky warmth that smelled of tobacco and the deep, earthy scent of the man holding her. She couldn't feel her feet. She couldn't feel her hands. All she could feel was the iron band of Arthur's arm around her waist, holding her so tight she could barely draw a breath, and the thunderous beat of his heart against her back. Every time the horse stumbled on the slick granite, Arthur would grunt a low, resonant sound in his chest and tighten his grip, pulling her deeper into him. He was a furnace, a wall, a force of nature that refused to yield to the storm. Almost there, he rumbled against her ear. The vibration traveled down her spine, grounding her when the dizziness threatened to pull her under. They climbed until the air grew thin and tasted of ozone. The trees, ancient pines twisted by the wind into gnarled shapes, began to thin out. Then the horse stopped. Clara cracked her swollen eye open. Through the swirl of snow she saw it. The cabin wasn't built on the mountain. It was carved into it. A massive overhang of granite formed a natural roof, protecting a structure made of logs the size of bridge pilings. It looked less like a home and more like a bunker, dark and imposing against the gray rock. Arthur dismounted. He hit the ground with a heavy thud that shook the snow from his boots. He didn't let go of her. He reached up, his massive hands spanning her waist, and pulled her down from the saddle. Her legs gave way the moment her boots touched the snow. Arthur caught her. He didn't stumble. He scooped her up into his arms, shielding her face from the wind with his shoulder, and marched toward the heavy oak door. He kicked it 3 sharp, demanding blows. The latch rattled. He shoved it open with his shoulder, carrying her into the sudden, stunning silence of the interior. He kicked the door shut behind them and dropped a heavy wooden bar into place. The roar of the wind vanished, replaced by the crackle of a dying fire in the massive stone hearth. The air inside was warm, thick with the scent of cedar and drying herbs. Arthur carried her to the center of the room. There was a large table there, hewn from a single slab of pine. He set her down on the edge of it, his hands lingering on her arms to steady her. "Stay," he ordered. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding under a boot heel. Clara nodded weakly. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She looked around. The cabin was sparse, masculine. A bed in the corner piled with furs, a wall covered in traps and tools, gleaming dully in the firelight, a shelf lined with jars of strange powders and dried roots. Arthur moved with a terrifying, efficient speed. He stoked the fire, throwing logs onto the embers until flames licked up the chimney. He grabbed a copper kettle, filled it from a barrel by the door, and hung it over the hook. Then he turned back to her. He looked at her wet, ruined dress. It was plastered to her skin, dark with rain and blood. She was shivering violently now, the adrenaline fading and leaving behind the bone-deep cold of the storm. "Clothes," Arthur grunted, "wet, freezing." He stepped closer. He reached for the buttons at her throat. Clara flinched. She couldn't help it. The movement was instinctive, born of years of learning that a man's touch meant pain. She jerked back, her hands flying up to cover her chest. Arthur froze. His hand hovered in the air, inches from her neck. His eyes, pale blue and unreadable, locked onto hers. "I am not him," he said. The words were slow, deliberate. "But you will die of cold if you stay in those rags." Clara lowered her hands slowly. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. I can't feel my fingers," she whispered. Arthur nodded. He didn't ask again. He reached into his belt and pulled a knife. Clara gasped, her eyes widening. "Quiet," Arthur commanded. He took the hem of her sleeve. With a flick of his wrist, the razor-sharp blade parted the sodden fabric. He cut the dress away from her arms, then the bodice. He was surgical, precise. The blade never touched her skin, but the cold steel grazed her gooseflesh, making her shiver. He peeled the wet fabric away, leaving her in her thin, torn chemise. "Turn," he said. Clara hesitated. Her back was a map of her father's rage. She felt a burning shame, hot and thick in her throat. She didn't want him to see. She didn't want the grizzly to see the broken thing she was. "Turn," Arthur repeated, his voice dropping an octave. It wasn't a request. Clara turned. She presented her back to him, bowing her head, waiting for the disgust, waiting for him to tell her she was damaged goods. Arthur looked. The firelight danced across her skin, illuminating the horror. It wasn't just tonight's beating. It was years of it. There were old, yellowing bruises overlaid with fresh, angry purples. There were welts that had raised the skin in jagged ridges. There was the deep, bleeding gash where the buckle had caught her shoulder blade. It was a canvas of cruelty, painted by the man who was supposed to protect her. Silence stretched in the cabin, heavy, suffocating. Then a sound tore through the room. "Rrrr!" It was a roar, a primal, animalistic sound of pure, unadulterated fury. Arthur slammed his fist onto the table next to her. Crack! The solid pine slab shuddered. The jar of herbs on the table jumped. Clara screamed. She threw herself forward, scrambling off the table, crashing to her knees on the hard floor. She curled into a ball, covering her head with her arms, sobbing. I'm sorry, don't hit me, please don't hit me." She pressed her face into the rough wood planks, waiting for the blow, waiting for the boot, waiting for the monster to finish what her father had started. Silence returned. But it was different this time. It wasn't heavy. It was stunned. Arthur stood frozen. His fist was still clenched on the table, his knuckles white. His chest heaved with the force of his rage, rage at Seamus, rage at the town, rage at himself for waiting so long. But when he looked down, he didn't see Seamus. He saw a girl he had just saved, a girl cowering on his floor, terrified of him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The rage drained out of him, replaced by a cold, sick feeling in his gut. I did this, he thought. I scared her. I am the monster now. He took a breath. He forced his hands to uncurl. He forced his shoulders to drop. He forced the growl back down into the dark place where he kept it. He moved. He didn't walk toward her. He walked to the fire. He took the kettle of boiling water. He poured it into a basin. He added a scoop of snow to cool it. He grabbed a clean, soft rag flannel from an old shirt. He walked back to where she lay curled on the floor. He didn't stand over her. He knelt. The mountain man, the grizzly, the killer of bears, went down on one knee. He was still huge, looming over her even in genuflection, but he made himself as small as he could. "Clara," he whispered. She didn't move. She was shaking, terrified sobs wrecking her small frame. "Clara, look at me." She shook her head against the floor. Arthur sighed, a sound like wind in the canyon. He reached out. He didn't grab her. He placed his hand on the floor, palm up, inches from her face, a peace offering. "I am a bear," he said softly. "I am loud, I am big, but I do not bite the wounded." Clara stopped crying. She listened to his voice. It was deep, yes, rough, yes, but it wasn't wet with gin. It wasn't sharp with malice, it was steady. She slowly lifted her head. She looked at the hand on the floor. It was scarred, calloused, stained with dirt and pine pitch, but it was open. She looked up at his face. The anger was gone. In the pale blue eyes, she saw something she had never seen in a man's face before. Pain. He was in pain because she was hurting. "Get up," he said gently. "The floor is cold. The fire is warm." Clara pushed herself up. Her legs were shaky, but she managed to kneel. Arthur reached out and took her arm. He didn't grip it. He supported it. He helped her stand. He guided her back to the table, but this time, he pulled the heavy wooden chair over. "Sit," he said. She sat. Arthur dipped the rag into the warm water. He wrung it out. Steam rose from the cloth, smelling of clean water and heat. He moved behind her. Clara tensed again, her muscles locking up. "Easy," Arthur murmured. "Just water, just heat." He touched the cloth to her shoulder. Clara hissed through her teeth as the heat met the raw skin, but then, relief. The warmth seeped into the bruise, melting the knot of tension. The water washed away the dried blood. Arthur worked in silence. He was agonizingly slow. He dabbed. He didn't scrub. He followed the lines of the welts with the reverence of a priest anointing a relic. Every time she flinched, he pulled back, waited, and whispered a quiet, "Easy, girl. I got you." He cleaned the gash on her shoulder. He washed the dirt from her arms. He cleaned the cut on her temple. When he was done, he went to the shelf and brought down a jar of salve bear grease mixed with arnica and comfrey. He warmed it in his hands before applying it. The grease smelled strong, but it took the sting out of the air. His fingers, so clumsy with buttons and latches, were incredibly precise on her skin. He rubbed the salve into the worst of the bruises, his touch firm but never painful. "Why?" Clara whispered, staring at the fire. "Why did you come?" Arthur's hand paused on her back. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the wall, seeing the years he had spent watching her from the shadows of the trading post, watching her fade, watching her bruise. "Because the wood splintered," he said simply, "and I could not watch it burn any more." He finished applying the salve. He picked up a heavy wool blanket from the bed, soft, thick, and clean. He draped it over her shoulders, wrapping her up, hiding the bruises from the world, hiding her from the cold. "Sleep," he ordered, pointing to the bed in the corner. "I take the chair." Clara looked at the bed. It was piled high with furs. It looked like a cloud. She looked at Arthur, who was already retreating to the door to check the bar, putting distance between them, giving her space. She walked to the bed. She climbed in. The furs swallowed her. For the first time in 20 years, she closed her eyes without locking a door, because the man guarding the door was the only thing in the world more terrifying than the storm outside, and he was on her side. The storm outside did not relent. It hammered the mountain with a fury that felt personal, burying the cabin under drifts of snow that reached the eaves. But inside, a different kind of storm had taken hold. The bruises on Clara's back, initially just angry purple welts, had turned angry in a different way. The cut from the buckle deep and jagged had festered. The heat of the cabin, meant to keep them alive, became a suffocating blanket for Clara as the fever took her. It started with a shivering that rattled her teeth, a bone deep cold that no amount of furs could banish. Then came the fire. For 3 days, time dissolved into a haze of agony and hallucinations. Clara wasn't in the cabin anymore. She was back in the shack, the smell of gin choking her, the sound of the belt cracking like a whip in the darkness. She thrashed on the bed, crying out, her hands clawing at the furs, as if they were the dirt floor of her father's house. "No, Pa, please, I didn't take it. I didn't." Her screams were thin, reedy things that tore at her raw throat. Arthur Vance did not sleep. The grizzly, a man who could track a cougar through a blizzard and sleep in a snowbank, found himself utterly helpless against an enemy he could not shoot, trap, or intimidate. He paced the small floor of the cabin, his heavy boots making a rhythmic thud-thud that vibrated through the timbers. He couldn't hunt. The storm was a whiteout, visibility reduced to the length of his arm. Even if he couldn't leave her. If the fire died, she died. If the fever spiked and she choked, she died. He became a nursemaid built of granite. He kept the fire roaring, feeding it the precious stockpile of seasoned oak he had gathered for the deep winter. He melted snow in the iron kettle, boiling it with strips of willow bark he peeled with his skinning knife, his massive hands working the delicate shavings with a trembling precision. Every hour he went to the bed. Clara would be thrashing, her skin burning hot to the touch, sweat plastering her hair to her forehead. "Shh," Arthur would rumble, a sound deep in his chest meant to mimic the low growl of a mother bear. "You are safe. The door is barred." He would wring out a cloth and cool snowmelt. He would sit on the edge of the bed, the mattress groaning under his weight, and wipe her face. He'd trace the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck, trying to draw the heat out into the rag. When she cried out for her father to stop, Arthur's jaw would clench until his teeth ached. He wanted to go back down the mountain. He wanted to find Seamus O'Malley's broken body and break it again. He wanted to tear the shack down plank by rotten plank. But he couldn't. He was tethered here by the fragile life tossing on his bed. "Drink," he would command softly, sliding his arm behind her shoulders to lift her. She was dead weight, limp and scorching hot. He held a tin cup to her lips, tilting it just enough to let a trickle of the bitter willow tea flow into her mouth. Most of it ran down her chin. He caught it with his thumb, wiping it away gently. "Fight it, Clara," he whispered into the darkness of the third night. "You survived the belt. Do not let the fever take you." He sat by the bed for hours, his gun cleaning kit forgotten on the table. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, terrified that each breath would be the last. He felt a strange, terrifying hollowness in his chest, a fear he hadn't felt since he was a boy. It was the fear of losing something he hadn't even known he wanted until he broke down a door to get it. On the fourth morning the wind died. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. The sun, weak and pale, filtered through the cracks in the shutters. Clara opened her eyes. The world was no longer spinning. The ceiling wasn't the rotting wood of the shack. It was sturdy, smoked logs. The smell wasn't gin, it was pine and sage. She felt weak, hollowed out, as if her bones had been replaced with glass. But the fire in her blood was gone, replaced by a dull, thirsty ache. She turned her head. Arthur was there. He was sitting in the wooden chair he had dragged to the bedside. His head was tipped back against the wall, his mouth slightly open, deep in an exhausted sleep. His beard was unkempt, his face drawn and gray with fatigue. Across his lap lay a double-barreled shotgun. His hand was resting on the stock, his finger inches from the triggers even in sleep. Clara stared at him. She looked at the size of him, the way his shoulders filled the chair, the massive hands that could crush a man's skull. And she realized he hadn't left. He hadn't gone hunting. He hadn't gone to town. He had sat in that chair, gun in lap, watching her breathe for days. Tears pricked her eyes not from pain but from a sudden, overwhelming realization of safety. She had spent her life being the target. Now, she was the treasure being guarded. She moved her hand. It felt heavy, dragging across the fur blanket. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the back of his hand, the one resting on the gun. Arthur woke instantly. There was no grogginess, no slow stretching. One moment he was asleep. The next, his blue eyes snapped open, clear and alert. His hand tightened on the shotgun stock before his brain registered the touch. He looked down. He saw her small pale hand resting on his scarred knuckles. He looked at her face. Her eyes were open, clear. The glassy sheen of the fever was gone. Arthur let out a breath that seemed to deflate his entire body. The shotgun lowered. He leaned forward, the chair creaking. "You're back," he rasped. His voice sounded like it hadn't been used in days. "Thirsty?" Clara whispered. Her voice was a dry croak. Arthur moved. He set the gun down. He poured water from a pitcher into a cup. He supported her head again, helping her drink. This time, she swallowed greedily, the cool water feeling like life itself. He lowered her back onto the pillows. He placed the back of his hand against her forehead, checking her temperature. His skin was rough, calloused, but cool. "Fever broke," he grunted. "You scared the devil out of me, girl." Clara looked at him, studying the dark circles under his eyes. "You stayed awake." "Someone had to keep the fire," Arthur dismissed, looking away. He seemed suddenly uncomfortable, shrinking back into his shell now that the crisis was over. "No," Clara said, her voice gaining a little strength. "You guarded me. You held me when I was screaming." Arthur looked at the fire. He rubbed his beard, his eyes shadowed. "You were screaming for him. You thought he was here." "I know," Clara whispered. She looked at the ceiling. "I always think he's there, even when I'm awake." She turned her head to look at him again. "Why, Arthur!" He stiffened. "Why what?" "Why did you come? You said the wood splintered, but you came so fast. You knew which house. You knew which door." Arthur went still. He looked down at his hands. Hands that had ended lives. Hands that had built this cabin. Hands that had failed to protect the one thing he cared about until it was almost too late. "I knew," he admitted, his voice low. He stood up and walked to the window, peering out through a crack in the shutter at the blinding white snow. "I come to town once a month," he began, not turning around, "for supplies, nails, powder, salt." He paused. "I saw you 3 years ago. You were 16. You were buying flour at the mercantile. You had a bruise on your cheek. You tried to hide it with your hair, but the wind blew it back." Clara's breath hitched. "I saw you again 2 months later," Arthur continued, his voice tightening. "Your arm was in a sling. You told the shopkeep you fell down the stairs. The shopkeep knew you were lying. Everyone knew. They just looked away." He turned to face her. The light from the window illuminated the jagged scar on his face, making him look fierce, but his eyes were filled with a profound, aching guilt. "I looked away too," he confessed. The shame in his voice was heavy. "I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself, I'm a mountain man. I live with the wolves. I don't get involved in the squabbles of town folk. I told myself I was too rough, too broken to help a delicate thing like you." He walked back to the chair and sat down heavily, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tight. "But I watched. Every month, I watched you get thinner. I watched the light go out of your eyes. I watched you turn into a ghost." He looked at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. "That night, I didn't come for supplies. I came because I had a feeling, a bad feeling in my gut that wouldn't let me sleep. I sat outside your shack for an hour in the rain. I listened." Clara felt a tear slide down her cheek. "You were outside?" "I was outside," Arthur nodded. "And when I heard the belt, when I heard you stop crying and just go silent, I knew." He reached out. He took her hand again. His grip was firm, desperate. "I didn't break that door down because I'm a hero, Clara. I broke it down because I hated myself. I hated myself for every time I walked away. I hated myself for letting him hurt you for 3 years while I sat up here safe in my mountain." He squeezed her hand. "I didn't save you," he whispered roughly. "I was just late, and I am sorry. I am so damn sorry I was late." Clara looked at this massive, terrifying man, seeing the cracks in the granite. He carried guilt like a stone. He thought he was a monster for waiting when everyone else had simply let her die. She turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. Her hand was so small in his, swallowed by his strength. "You came," she whispered. "The sheriff didn't come. The priest didn't come. My neighbors didn't come. You came." She squeezed his hand back, weak but steady. "You aren't late, Arthur. You're the only one who showed up." Arthur looked at their joined hands. He took a shuddering breath. He lifted her hand and pressed it to his forehead, closing his eyes, hiding the wetness that gathered there. For a long time, the only sound in the cabin was the crackle of the fire, and the wind outside, no longer a scream, but a song. They sat there, the broken girl and the guilt-ridden bear, bound together by the heat of her fever and the cold of his regret, realizing that in the silence of the snow, they were no longer alone. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. The thaw came not with a whisper, but with a roar. 1 week after Clara's fever broke, the sun finally pierced the cloud cover. It was weak at first, then blinding, turning the world into a painful, dazzling white. The icicles that hung like daggers from the eaves began to weep, and the sound of dripping water became a constant rhythmic percussion in the silent cabin. Clara was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a quilt. Her strength was returning slowly, like sap rising in spring. The bruises on her face had faded to yellow and green maps of healing. She watched Arthur chopping wood in the yard. He moved with a brutal, mesmerizing efficiency. Thwack! Crack! Toss each swing of the axe a release of pent-up energy. That sound cut through the clear mountain air. Crack! It wasn't wood splitting, it was sharper, a whip-crack sound that echoed off the canyon walls. A clay jar on the porch railing next to Clara exploded into dust. Clara froze. She stared at the shards of pottery, her mind failing to process the violence. Arthur didn't freeze. He dropped the axe instantly. He didn't look around. He didn't shout. He moved. He sprinted toward the porch, his heavy boots pounding the slush. He scooped Clara up in one fluid motion, shielding her body with his own as he dove through the open door of the cabin. Thud! A second bullet buried itself in the doorframe, inches from where Clara's head had been a second ago. Arthur kicked the door shut. He slammed the heavy oak bar into place. "Get down!" he roared, his voice shaking the small room. "Away from the windows!" Clara scrambled across the floor, pressing herself into the corner behind the heavy wood stove. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Arthur? Who is that?" Arthur ignored her. He was moving with terrifying speed. He grabbed his Winchester from the wall. He grabbed a box of ammunition. He grabbed the double-barreled shotgun from beside the bed. He crawled to the window, staying below the sill. He peeked through a crack in the shutter. "5 of them," he growled. "Sheriff Miller, 2 deputies, and—" He paused. His jaw tightened until the muscles jumped. "Him." Clara stopped breathing. "My father?" "Alive," Arthur spat. "Should have hit him harder." Outside, a voice echoed from the tree line. It was thin, reedy, and full of a manic, desperate bravado. "Vance, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up. You're under arrest for kidnapping and assault." It was Silas. He sounded drunk on power and rage. "Send the girl out," the sheriff shouted, his voice deeper, authoritative. "We just want the girl, Vance. Nobody else has to get hurt." Arthur looked back at Clara. His face was a mask of cold, deadly resolve. The guilt she had seen by the bedside was gone. In its place was the grizzly. "They aren't here for justice," Arthur whispered. "They're here because I embarrassed them, because I took what they thought belonged to them." He crawled over to her. He pressed the shotgun into her hands. It was heavy, cold, and smelled of gun oil. "Listen to me," he said, his blue eyes boring into hers. "If they breach the door, if I go down, you point this at the first thing that comes through. You pull both triggers. Do not hesitate." Clara stared at the gun. Her hands were shaking. She had never held a weapon in her life. She was the girl who curled up and took the beating. I can't," she whimpered. Arthur grabbed her shoulders. "You can. You survived him for 20 years. You are stronger than you know. Do not let them take you back to that shack." He stood up then. He didn't stay inside. He wasn't going to wait to be sieged. He moved to the back of the cabin, where a small hidden door led to the root cellar and a narrow escape tunnel he had dug years ago for just such an occasion. "Stay down," he commanded. "I'm going to flank them." He disappeared into the dark hole in the floor. Clara was alone. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. She clutched the shotgun to her chest, listening to the wind, listening to the blood rushing in her ears. Outside, the shooting started. Bang, bang! Arthur had emerged from the tunnel behind the rocks to the east. He caught them by surprise. "He's behind us!" someone screamed. The sound of gunfire erupted, a chaotic, deafening roar. Clara covered her ears, squeezing her eyes shut. She heard men shouting. She heard horses screaming. Boom! That was the Winchester. Slow, rhythmic, deadly. Then silence. Clara waited. Had he won? Was he dead? A heavy thud on the porch. Boots on the wood. Clara raised the shotgun. Her knuckles were white. She pointed it at the door. The handle jiggled, locked. Then a shadow passed the window. Glass shattered. A hand reached in and unlatched the shutter. It swung open. A man climbed through. It wasn't Arthur. It was Silas. He tumbled into the room, gasping for breath. He was bleeding from a graze on his arm, and his eyes were wide with panic. He looked wild, like a cornered rat. He stood up, brushing glass from his coat. He scanned the room. He saw her. Clara sat in the corner, the shotgun leveled at his chest. Silas froze. Then a slow, ugly grin spread across his face. "Well now," he sneered, stepping over the broken glass. "Look at you, playing soldier." He took a step toward her. "Put that down, girl. You don't have the guts." Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. "Stay back, Pa." "Or what?" Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You gonna shoot your own father? After everything I did for you? I fed you. I put a roof over your head." "You beat me!" Clara screamed, the years of silence finally shattering. "You starved me. You made me wish I was dead." Silas's face darkened. The veneer of civility vanished. He lunged. "Give me that!" He grabbed the barrel of the shotgun. He was strong, fueled by adrenaline and rage. He wrenched it from her grip, throwing it across the room. It clattered uselessly into the corner. Clara scrambled back, but she was trapped. Silas loomed over her. He raised his hand, the same hand that had held the belt, the same hand that had shaped her nightmares. "You ungrateful little witch," he hissed. "I'm going to teach you a lesson you won't wake up from." He struck. His fist connected with her jaw. Clara's head snapped back. Pain exploded in her skull. But this time, she didn't curl up. This time, she didn't count the splinters. Her hand brushed against something cold on the floor. The skinning knife Arthur had left by the stove. Silas raised his hand for a second blow. Clara didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the knife. She thrust upward. The blade sank deep into Silas's thigh. Silas howled a high, shocked sound. He stumbled back, clutching his leg, blood spurting between his fingers. "You bit me," he gasped, staring at her in disbelief. Clara scrambled to her feet. She held the bloody knife in front of her, her hands shaking, but her eyes burning with a fierce, terrified light. "Get out!" she screamed. "Get out of my house!" Seamus looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the bruises he had put there. He saw the fear. But he also saw something new. He saw the mountain in her eyes. He took a step toward her, rage overcoming the pain. "I'll kill you!" The door burst open. The bars shattered. Arthur Vance stood there. He was terrifying. Blood ran down his face from a cut on his forehead. His coat was torn. He held a tomahawk in one hand and his empty Winchester in the other. He saw Seamus advancing on Clara. He saw the knife in Clara's hand. He saw the blood on the floor. He dropped the gun. He roared. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of a grizzly defending its cub. He crossed the room in a blur. He grabbed Seamus by the back of his coat and hurled him backward. Seamus flew through the air, crashing through the open window he had just entered. He landed on the porch with a sickening crunch. Arthur didn't stop. He vaulted through the window after him. Clara ran to the opening. She saw them on the porch. Seamus was trying to crawl away, dragging his wounded leg. Arthur stood over him, chest heaving, the tomahawk raised. "Please," Seamus begged, holding up his hands. "Vance! Mercy, I'm her father!" Arthur paused. The tomahawk hovered. He looked back at the window. He saw Clara standing there, the knife still in her hand, blood on her dress. He looked at Seamus. "You lost that title the first time you hit her," Arthur growled. He lowered the tomahawk. He didn't strike. Instead, he grabbed Seamus by the collar and dragged him to the edge of the porch. Below them was a sheer drop 50 feet to the rocky creek bed below. "Don't come back," Arthur said. He let go. Seamus scrabbled for purchase on the slick wood, his eyes wide with terror. But the momentum was already there. He slid over the edge. His scream was short, cut off abruptly by the sound of a heavy impact on stone. Arthur stood there for a long moment, staring down into the ravine. Then he turned. He looked at Clara. He saw the blood on her face. He saw the knife in her hand. He walked to the window. He reached through and gently took the knife from her trembling fingers. He dropped it on the porch. He climbed back inside. He didn't say a word. He simply pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, holding her so tight she thought her ribs might crack again. But this time, she didn't care. She buried her face in his fur coat and wept. Not for pain, but for the freedom of knowing the monster was finally gone. The silence that followed the violence was heavier than the snow that still clung to the north face of the Iron Tooth. It was a vacuum, rushing in to fill the space where the gunshots and screams had been, sucking the air from the cabin until the only sensation left was the rhythmic thumping of Clara's own heart against her ribs, pressed tight against the rough wool of Arthur's coat. Arthur held her for a long time. His breathing was ragged, a wet, hitching sound in his chest that spoke of exhaustion and the adrenaline crash. He smelled of copper and cordite, the scent of the carnage he had wrought to keep her safe. Slowly, his grip loosened. He pulled back, his large hands lingering on her arms, as if checking to make sure she was still solid, still real. He looked down at her. His face was a ruin. The cut on his forehead from a ricocheted splinter of wood was bleeding freely, tracking a dark, viscous line down his temple and into his beard. His eyes, usually so sharp and slate-gray, were wide and swimming with a terrifying mixture of relief and horror. He looked at the blood on her hands, Seamus's blood. He looked at the open window where he had thrown her father to his death. He looked at the shotgun lying in the corner. He flinched. He stepped back from her as if he were burning. "Arthur?" Clara whispered, her voice cracking. Arthur didn't answer. He turned away, his boots crunching on the broken glass that littered the floor. He walked to the door, his movements stiff and jerky. He looked out onto the porch, scanning the tree line, scanning the yard where the sheriff and his deputies lay silent in the snow. The wind whistled through the bullet holes in the doorframe, a mournful, lonely sound. "They're gone," he rasped. His voice was hollow. "The others ran. The sheriff is. He is finished." He closed the door. He tried to latch it, but the latch was shattered. He stared at the broken wood, his hand trembling. He turned back to the room. He walked past Clara, giving her a wide berth, and went to the basin by the stove. He pumped water, the handle squeaking in the quiet room. He began to scrub his hands. He scrubbed them with a manic, desperate intensity, using the rough lye soap until the suds turned pink and his skin turned raw. "Arthur, you're bleeding," Clara said, stepping toward him. She reached for a clean rag. "Don't," Arthur growled. Clara froze. Arthur gripped the edge of the basin, his knuckles white. He didn't look at her. "Don't touch me, Clara. Not now, not with this on me." He looked at his hands, clean of blood but stained with invisible guilt. "I killed him," Arthur whispered. "I threw him off the ledge like a sack of garbage. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel anything." He turned to face her, anguish twisting his scarred features. "I am a killer, Clara. I have always been a killer. That is why I live up here. That is why I stay away from town, because the beast is always just under the skin." He walked to the bed. He reached under it and pulled out an old, battered canvas duffel bag. Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "What are you doing?" Arthur didn't answer. He began to move around the cabin, grabbing things. A tin of dried beef, a bag of coins he kept hidden in a hollow log near the hearth, a heavy wool blanket. He shoved them into the bag. His movements were frantic, clumsy. "The pass will be clear in 2 days," he said, talking to the bag, not to her. "I will saddle the horse. I will take you to the railhead in Silverton. You have the money. You can go east, far east, where nobody knows the name O'Malley, where nobody knows the name Vance." He turned to the shelf and grabbed a small hunting knife, not the one she had used, but a clean one. He put it in the bag. "Arthur, stop," Clara said, her voice trembling. "You can't stay here," Arthur continued, his voice rising, cracking with desperation. "Look at this place. It is a fortress of violence. The law will come back. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but they will come. They will hang me, Clara. And if you are here, they will take you too." He zipped the bag shut with a finality that echoed in the room. He walked over to her and held it out. "Take it," he commanded. "Pack your things. We leave at first light." Clara looked at the bag. She looked at the man holding it, the giant who had broken down a door to save her, who had sat by her bedside for 3 days while she burned with fever, who had thrown himself into a hail of bullets to protect her. She saw the fear in his eyes. He wasn't afraid of the law. He was afraid of corrupting her. He was afraid that his darkness would swallow her light. Clara didn't take the bag. She took a step forward. "No," she said. Arthur blinked. "Clara, listen to me." "No," she repeated, louder this time. She reached out and took the bag from his hand. She didn't sling it over her shoulder. She turned around and dumped it out on the table. The coins clattered. The beef thudded. The knife spun on the wood. Clara turned back to him. Her hands were shaking, but her chin was high. The girl who had counted splinters in the floorboards was gone. In her place was a woman forged in the fire of his protection. "You think you're a monster?" she asked, her voice steady. "Because you killed him? Because you killed the man who beat me until I couldn't see? The man who starved me? The man who tried to sell me to the bank?" She stepped closer. She reached up. Arthur flinched, expecting her to hit him, expecting her to recoil. She didn't. She placed her hand on his cheek, right over the beard, right over the drying blood. "You didn't kill a father, Arthur," she whispered. "You killed a demon. You sent him back to the hell he crawled out of." "I am blood," Arthur choked out, closing his eyes against her touch. "I am violence. I will only hurt you." "You cleaned my wounds," Clara countered softly. "You cooled my fever. You held me when I screamed. That is not violence, Arthur. That is love." She moved her hand to the cut on his forehead. She took the rag she had been holding and gently wiped away the blood. "You broke the door down," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "You broke the door to my cage. Do not try to build a new one to keep me out." Arthur opened his eyes. He looked at her. He saw the bruises fading on her face. He saw the strength in her jaw. He saw the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. "The law," he started weakly. "The sheriff is dead," Clara said flatly, "and everyone in that town knows what Seamus was. They won't come up here. They're afraid of the grizzly. Let them be afraid." She dropped the rag. She took both of his large, rough hands in hers. "I am not going to Silverton. I am not going east. This is my home. You are my home. If you want me to leave, Arthur Vance, you will have to throw me off that porch yourself." Arthur stared at her. The air left his lungs. He looked at the window, then back at her. The idea of throwing her, it made him physically ill. He realized then that he had lost. The solitude he had cherished for 20 years was gone, shattered by the same hammer blow that had broken the O'Malley door, and he didn't want it back. He let out a long, shuddering breath. His shoulders slumped. The grizzly faded, leaving just a man tired, wounded, and desperately in love. He stammered. "I don't know how to be soft." Clara smiled. It was a small thing, but it lit up the dark cabin. "I don't need soft, Arthur. I need safe. And I have never been safer than I am right now." Arthur made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. He pulled his hands from hers and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into his chest. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, letting the tension of the last month finally, truly dissolve. "Stay," he whispered into her hair. "Stay forever." "Forever," Clara promised. Epilogue 1 year later. The winter was hard that year, but the spring that followed was glorious. The Iron Tooth was alive with colored bluebells and Indian paintbrush carpeting the slopes in a riot of purple and red. The cabin had changed. The broken door had been replaced with a sturdy new one, thick oak reinforced with iron bands, but it stood open to the morning sun. A rocking chair sat on the porch, draped with a colorful quilt. A garden had been dug in the side yard, fenced high to keep the deer out, where rows of potatoes and hardy mountain kale grew in the dark soil. Arthur Vance stood by the woodpile. He was shirtless in the warming sun, his scars silver in the light. He was splitting logs, the rhythm of the axe. Thwack, crack, thwack echoing off the canyon walls. He moved with the same power as before, but the desperate feral edge was gone. He stopped, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. He looked toward the cabin. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She was radiant. Her hair, once dull and brittle, shone like spun gold in the sunlight. Her dress was simple, blue calico, but it was clean and mended. She walked with a hand resting on the swell of her stomach. She was heavy with child, 7 months along. She held a tin cup of cool water. She walked down the steps, moving carefully but without fear. "Thirsty work," she said, smiling as she reached him. Arthur dropped the axe. He didn't just take the cup. He took her free hand first, bringing it to his lips to kiss the knuckles that were no longer bruised, no longer trembling. "Just clearing the deadfall," he rumbled, his voice deep and warm, "making room for the new growth." He took the cup and drank, his eyes never leaving her face. He looked at her belly, where his child grew safe and warm. He reached out and placed his large, calloused hand on her stomach. The baby kicked a strong, vigorous thump against his palm. Arthur's face split into a grin that transformed him. The scar on his cheek crinkled. The slate-gray eyes softened to the color of the summer sky. "Strong," he said proudly, "like a bear." "Stubborn," Clara corrected, laughing, "like his father." Arthur laughed, a booming sound that rolled down the valley, chasing away the last ghosts of the past. He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "Let him be stubborn," Arthur whispered. "Let him be loud. Let him scream if he wants to, because in this house—" He kissed her, tasting the sunlight and the peace they had fought for. "In this house nobody hurts. In this house we only protect." Clara leaned into him, closing her eyes, listening to the steady beat of his heart and the wind in the pines. The door was open, the gun was hung on the wall, and the grizzly was no longer alone in the winter. He was a father, a husband, and a home, and that was enough.